There's a specific kind of confusion that surfaces once someone starts researching what actually happened to them, reading about narcissistic abuse, recognizing genuine patterns, feeling genuine relief at finally having language for their experience, only to encounter, somewhere in that same research, descriptions of psychopathy that also seem to fit disturbingly well. And suddenly the clarity that felt so hard-won starts to waver again, replaced by a new, more urgent question. Which one was I actually dealing with? And does the answer actually change anything about how I understand what happened or how I need to heal from it? This is what we're exploring today, and I want to be genuinely precise about the terrain we're covering because these terms get used loosely online in ways that don't always match what they actually mean, and that looseness has real costs, both for accuracy and for your own peace of mind as you try to make sense of your specific experience. Narcissism, psychopathy, and sociopathy are distinct psychological constructs with real, meaningful differences between them, even though they share significant overlap and even though only a licensed professional can offer genuine diagnostic clarity about any specific individual. What we're going to do today is walk through what actually distinguishes these patterns, why the distinction matters practically for your own healing, and why, in many important respects, the distinction matters less than most people initially assume. Let's start with narcissism, because it's the pattern this entire series has spent considerable time tracing throughout its full length, and it's worth summarizing its core features precisely before contrasting them with something genuinely different. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the underlying architecture of narcissistic psychology, a fragile, externally dependent sense of self, built around continuous need for admiration and validation, defended by an elaborate structure specifically designed to avoid confronting an underlying belief of fundamental insufficiency. Crucially, and this distinction matters enormously for what follows, this entire structure typically still involves genuine emotional experience underneath the defenses, real fear, real shame, real, if severely limited, capacity for attachment, and even, in some cases, genuine remorse, however inconsistently and incompletely that remorse tends to surface. This is worth understanding as the foundation for everything that distinguishes narcissism from psychopathy specifically, because the difference isn't primarily about the harmful behavior itself, which can look remarkably similar from the outside in both patterns. The difference lies considerably deeper in what's actually happening or not happening at the level of genuine emotional capacity. Narcissistic psychology, however severely impaired its capacity for genuine empathy has become, typically still retains some underlying emotional architecture, fear of abandonment, genuine if fragile attachment, a capacity for guilt that, while frequently overridden by defensive mechanisms, isn't entirely absent. Let's talk about psychopathy now, because it represents something genuinely, structurally different, not simply a more severe or more extreme version of the same underlying pattern. This distinction matters enormously, and it's worth stating directly. Psychopathy, as understood in clinical and research contexts, typically involves a considerably more fundamental absence of certain emotional capacities, not simply their suppression or defensive override, but their genuine structural underdevelopment or absence. Research into psychopathy has consistently pointed toward differences in how fear, particularly fear of consequences, and genuine empathic response actually register neurologically, differences that appear considerably more fundamental than the defensive, protective mechanisms we've traced throughout this entire series regarding narcissistic psychology. Here's what this actually means in practical terms, worth understanding precisely because it explains some genuinely important behavioral differences. A narcissist's harmful behavior, however damaging, typically still exists within a framework of genuine, if distorted, emotional need. Hurting you specifically because your reaction confirms their significance, because your pain, paradoxically, still matters to their sense of self in some twisted, dependent way. A psychopath's harmful behavior tends to operate through a considerably more instrumental, considerably more detached framework, using people because using them achieves specific, practical goals with genuine indifference to their suffering rather than any complex defensive relationship to it. The narcissist needs you to feel their significance. The psychopath structurally doesn't need this in the same way at all. Let's talk about why this distinction actually matters practically, beyond simply satisfying intellectual curiosity about which label applies to your specific experience. Remember, everything we've traced throughout this entire series about narcissistic psychology occasionally, if rarely, producing something resembling genuine reflection, particularly once external consequence becomes severe and undeniable enough, or once every strategic tactic has genuinely been exhausted without success. This possibility, rare as it remains, exists specifically because some underlying emotional architecture remains present, capable, in genuinely rare circumstances, of being reached. Psychopathy structurally offers considerably less basis for this same possibility, not because change is impossible in some absolute sense, but because the underlying emotional capacity this rare reflection would need to draw upon appears, according to current understanding, considerably more fundamentally limited or absent. This is worth understanding as genuinely important for anyone trying to decide how much hope to hold for eventual change, eventual accountability, or eventual genuine acknowledgement. If you've been holding on to hope specifically because you understood the person you're dealing with as narcissistic, believing some rare, if unlikely possibility of genuine reflection remained theoretically available, and you're now wondering whether what you actually experienced more closely resembles psychopathy instead, this distinction genuinely matters for calibrating what you should realistically expect going forward. What we haven't yet explored is how to actually distinguish between these two patterns in practice, given how similarly their harmful behavior can present from the outside. What sociopathy adds to this picture as a third, related but distinct construct, and why, despite everything we've traced about these genuine distinctions, the practical implications for your own healing and your own boundaries often matter far less than you might expect, regardless of which specific pattern you were actually dealing with. Let's talk about how to actually distinguish between these two patterns in practice, because this matters, but it's worth naming an important caveat directly before we go further. Distinguishing narcissism from psychopathy with genuine confidence, from the outside, without clinical training, is considerably harder than most online content suggests, and it's worth holding whatever conclusions you reach with appropriate humility rather than absolute certainty. Here's what's worth watching for: understanding these as meaningful indicators rather than definitive proof. The first involves consistency of the harmful behavior across contexts where genuine risk of consequence differs considerably. Narcissistic behavior, remember, tends to be at least somewhat responsive to genuine threat, softening or shifting when consequences become severe enough, precisely because some underlying fear and some underlying need for social standing remains genuinely operative. Psychopathic behavior tends to show less consistent responsiveness to this kind of threat, sometimes continuing harmful patterns even when the practical cost of doing so seems genuinely high, because the calculation involved operates through a different framework, one less anchored in genuine fear of social or emotional consequence and more purely instrumental, weighing costs and benefits without the same underlying emotional stakes narcissistic psychology typically retains. The second indicator worth watching for involves the presence or absence of what might be called leakage. Brief, unguarded moments where genuine emotion, however fleeting, becomes visible beneath the usual defenses. Remember everything we traced in an earlier exploration throughout this series regarding grief leakage following the end of a relationship, moments of irritability, volatility, or unexpected emotional intensity that suggest something genuine is being processed underneath the surface, even if imperfectly and indirectly. This kind of leakage, when it occurs, tends to suggest narcissistic rather than psychopathic patterns because it indicates genuine emotional material actually exists, requiring management, rather than a considerably more consistent, unwavering absence of anything requiring that kind of internal management at all. The third indicator worth watching for, and this one deserves particular attention because it's genuinely revealing, involves the specific texture of any apparent remorse when it does occasionally surface. Narcissistic remorse, rare and inconsistent as it often is, still tends to include genuine emotional content, visible distress, even if that distress remains ultimately self-focused rather than genuinely oriented toward your well-being. Psychopathic patterns, when apparent remorse surfaces at all, tend to display something considerably more performed and considerably more purely strategic, emotional display, without the underlying emotional texture that narcissistic remorse, however flawed and self-centered, still typically retains. Let's talk about sociopathy now, because it deserves its own attention as a related but genuinely distinct construct, one that adds meaningful nuance to this entire discussion. Sociopathy is worth understanding as sharing considerable overlap with psychopathy, particularly regarding reduced empathic capacity and reduced responsiveness to conventional social and moral constraint, but differing in ways worth naming directly. Sociopathy is generally understood to develop more significantly through environmental factors, particularly early trauma, chaotic upbringing, or severe developmental adversity, rather than through the more heavily biological or neurological factors research has associated with psychopathy specifically. This distinction matters because it suggests, at least theoretically, somewhat greater plasticity, a somewhat greater theoretical possibility that genuinely different early circumstances might have produced meaningfully different outcomes, though this theoretical plasticity shouldn't be mistaken for easy, likely change in someone you're currently dealing with as an adult. Sociopathic patterns also tend to present with somewhat more visible impulsivity and somewhat less of the careful, sustained planning sometimes associated with psychopathic behavior specifically, along with somewhat more capacity for attachment to specific individuals or specific in-groups, even while maintaining genuine disregard for people outside that narrower circle. This is worth understanding as adding real texture to this entire discussion, though it's also worth acknowledging honestly that these three constructs, narcissism, sociopathy, and psychopathy, exist considerably more as overlapping territories on a complex spectrum than as three neatly separate, easily distinguished categories, which is precisely why professional, clinical assessment remains the only genuinely reliable way to distinguish between them with real confidence. Now let's talk about why, despite everything we've traced about these genuine, meaningful distinctions, the practical implications for your own healing and your own boundaries often matter far less than you might expect, regardless of which specific pattern you were actually dealing with. This is worth understanding as the actual, most important insight this exploration has been building toward, because it addresses something genuinely important. The risk of becoming so absorbed in correctly diagnosing your specific situation that this diagnostic project itself becomes a substitute for the actual, considerably more important work of healing and moving forward, regardless of exactly which label most accurately applies. This brings us to the final and most important part of this exploration, the one where we need to address directly why the practical response to harmful behavior, protecting yourself, setting boundaries, releasing hope for accountability that may never arrive, remains remarkably consistent regardless of the specific underlying diagnostic category, and why understanding this consistency matters considerably more for your actual healing than achieving perfect diagnostic certainty ever could. Let's talk directly about why the practical response remains remarkably consistent regardless of which specific label most accurately applies, because this is genuinely the most important insight this entire exploration has been building toward, and it's worth stating with real clarity before we close. Here's what's worth understanding precisely. Whether you were dealing with narcissism, sociopathy, or genuine psychopathy, the actual practical requirements for your own healing and your own safety remain almost entirely identical. You still need to trust your own perception of what happened, regardless of the underlying diagnostic category. You still need to grieve what was lost, genuinely and fully, regardless of whether the person who caused that loss has a fundamentally intact but defensively suppressed capacity for empathy or a more fundamentally limited one. You still need to release hope for an apology or genuine accountability that may never arrive. Because, as we've traced throughout this entire series, this hope functions as an obstacle to healing regardless of whether the underlying reason for its unlikely arrival is defensive avoidance or genuine structural absence. You still need to build boundaries, rebuild self-trust, and construct a life that doesn't depend on their eventual understanding. And every single one of these requirements applies with equal force regardless of which specific diagnostic category best describes what you actually survived. This is worth understanding as genuinely liberating because it means you don't actually need diagnostic certainty in order to begin or continue the genuine work of healing. So many people spend considerable time and energy trying to achieve perfect clarity about exactly what they were dealing with, researching extensively, comparing symptom lists, seeking confirmation from various sources, and this project, while understandable, can quietly become its own kind of holding pattern, a sophisticated, intellectually engaging way of remaining oriented around understanding them, rather than actually moving forward with the considerably more important work of understanding and rebuilding yourself. Let's talk about why this diagnostic uncertainty, uncomfortable as it is, doesn't actually need to be fully resolved in order for you to move forward with genuine confidence. Remember something worth naming directly. You don't actually need a clinical diagnosis in order to trust what you experienced. The specific behaviors that hurt you, the manipulation, the lack of genuine accountability, the harm to your own sense of self and safety, remain real and remain worth protecting yourself from, regardless of whether the underlying psychological mechanism producing them technically qualifies as narcissism, sociopathy, or psychopathy according to formal clinical criteria that only a professional working directly with that specific individual could ever actually determine with genuine confidence. Here's the deepest insight worth carrying forward from everything we've traced across this entire exploration. The question this title poses, narcissistic abuse or psychopathic abuse, deserves genuine, honest engagement, which is exactly what we've offered throughout this exploration. Real distinctions worth understanding, real differences worth being aware of, particularly regarding realistic expectations for future change or accountability. But the question was never actually meant to become the central ongoing project of your own healing. It was meant to offer useful context, alongside everything else this entire series has traced, not to become a new, sophisticated form of the exact same problem this entire series has repeatedly warned against, remaining oriented around understanding them in ever-increasing precision and detail, rather than fully, genuinely turning your attention toward rebuilding your own life. So if you've spent time genuinely uncertain about which specific label best describes what you survived, wondering whether you were dealing with narcissism or something considerably more severe, let this be what you carry forward from everything we've explored today. That uncertainty, uncomfortable as it is, doesn't actually need full resolution in order for your healing to proceed. What you experienced was real. What it cost you was real. And everything this entire series has traced about rebuilding self-trust, releasing hope for external validation, constructing genuine boundaries, and building a life that no longer depends on their eventual understanding, all of it applies, fully and completely, regardless of which specific diagnostic category ultimately, if ever, turns out to be most accurate. You were never actually required to become a diagnostic expert in someone else's psychology in order to earn the right to heal from what they did to you. That right was always, entirely, already yours. Let's go further into something worth naming directly because it deserves genuine space. What actually happens when someone becomes genuinely stuck in the diagnostic project we described in Part 3, spending months or even years researching, comparing, seeking increasingly precise language for what they survived, without that research ever translating into the actual, practical work of healing this entire series has traced throughout its full length. Here's what this pattern often looks like in practice, and it's worth naming with genuine compassion rather than criticism, because it typically emerges from an entirely understandable place. Precise understanding can feel in the moment like genuine progress because it produces real, tangible insight, moments of recognition, moments where scattered, confusing experiences finally resolve into coherent, nameable patterns. This feeling of progress is genuine, and it's worth honoring rather than dismissing, but it's also worth recognizing honestly when this particular kind of progress has plateaued, when additional research and additional precision have stopped producing genuinely new insight and have instead become a comfortable, familiar activity, one that provides the feeling of productive engagement without actually requiring the considerably more difficult, considerably more uncertain work of building an entirely new life independent of everything being so carefully researched. Let's talk about a specific, practical way to recognize when this shift has occurred, because it's worth having a concrete marker rather than leaving this distinction abstract. Ask yourself honestly, in the past month, has time spent researching or thinking about the specific psychological classification of what you survived exceeded time spent actively building something new, a relationship, a skill, a routine, a genuine source of meaning entirely disconnected from this research? If research has become the dominant activity, considerably outweighing genuine forward movement, this imbalance is worth taking seriously, not as evidence of failure, but as useful, actionable information about where your energy actually needs to redirect. Let's talk about something else worth naming honestly here, because it addresses a specific, quiet fear that sometimes underlies this particular pattern. The worry that releasing the diagnostic project somehow means releasing validation of how genuinely harmful the experience actually was. This fear deserves direct address, because it's worth stating clearly that moving forward with your healing doesn't require abandoning the truth of what happened. You can hold, simultaneously and without contradiction, complete confidence that what you survived was genuinely harmful, genuinely worth protecting yourself from, and genuine acceptance that further diagnostic precision beyond a certain point stops adding meaningful value to your own healing process. These two things were never actually in tension, even though the fear of losing validation can sometimes make them feel that way. Let's close with something important worth carrying forward from this specific edition: the considerable knowledge you've built across this exploration and across this entire series about narcissism, psychopathy, sociopathy, and everything in between remains genuinely valuable, worth keeping, worth having developed. But knowledge, at a certain point, has done what it can do. It's given you language, given you validation, given you protective understanding about patterns to watch for going forward. What it cannot do, no matter how much further it gets refined or how much more precise it eventually becomes, is build the actual, lived life waiting on the other side of understanding. The relationships, the interests, the genuine sense of self this entire series has consistently pointed toward as the real, final destination. That building was always going to require something knowledge alone could never quite provide: the willingness to simply, finally begin.